Okay, so we'll get right into the history of ABA and we'll do a short, pretty brief scenario of several key people that helped develop the field. The first person we will talk about is John B. Watson. He was basically one of the founding fathers of behaviorism. In 1913, he published Psychology as a Behaviorist Views It, which was a really big deal at the time. Most psychologists were focusing on introspective behaviors, mind theory, mental processes. They weren't necessarily focusing on observable or measurable behaviors. So when John B. Watson um, published this article, it was really focusing on those observable and measurable behaviors and how we could predict them and control them. So he developed the relationship between environmental stimuli, or S, and the responses, R, they evoke. Um, he really thought basically that we could um, predict and control human behavior based on that. And that was a really early form of behaviorism. He was pretty extreme in his rhetoric. However, we can claim the shift in psychology to behaviorism to John B. Watson. So he's a really important figure within the ABA field. Following John B. Watson, we can talk about B.F. Skinner. You guys have probably heard about B.F. Skinner. He is well known for the Skinner box and those experiments, which we will later talk about. But basically, B.F. Skinner founded EAB, Experimental Analysis of Behavior, through his publication of The Behavior as Organisms in 1938. So he really looked at how to implement behavior change through experiments. Um, so basically, B.F. Skinner published this work, and that's what created EAB. Through his lab work, he established respondent and operant behaviors. So, respondent behaviors are those that are elicited by stimuli that directly precede it. So, they're always reflexive and involuntary. Um, so, again, respondent behaviors are elicited by preceding stimuli. They're reflexive. So, if you guys remember Pavlov's dogs, Pavlov is another important figure, but he set up experimentation so that he could elicit salivation through his dogs. One, when food was presented and the dogs would salivate, reflexive behavior. But then he paired a bell with the food presentation, and eventually the dogs salivated just under the condition of the bell alone. So that's respondent behaviors, are reflexive or involuntary behaviors. Um, B.F. Skinner took that one more step. So he looked at operant behaviors. So he was really interested in spontaneous behaviors as well, not just reflexive or involuntary, and that's what led him to operant behaviors. So operant behaviors are influenced by the stimuli that follow the behavior. So rather than looking at what happens right before the behavior, he looked at what happens right after the behavior. And that was pretty new in terms of the field of ABA. So he really wanted to find causal relationships. So he looked at the environment in order to measure observable things, but then he looked at the consequence, what happened right after, in order to develop those causal relationships. So that really established our three-term contingency. So, which is our stimulus, our response, and our stimulus. And we'll go into more depth on that when we talk about reinforcement as well. So the three-term contingency doesn't necessarily replace the SR contingency. There is still a stimulus and response class as well, but we also have a stimulus, response, stimulus. And so that was really through EAB and Skinner's work where we were able to develop both the respondent behaviors, but also the operant behaviors.